There is a fear so old it predates language, the fear of waking up and realizing you can't move, can't breathe, and can't scream. Throughout history, people have been buried alive by mistake, declared dead too soon, sealed into coffins, lowered into the ground while still conscious. Some were exhumed, some clawed their way out, and some only left behind signs that they had been awake the entire time. What you're about to hear are true stories of premature burial, collected from multiple cases across different eras. Accounts of people who woke up underground, trapped in darkness, fighting panic, time, and the slow realization that no one could hear them. This is not one story. This is every buried alive nightmare brought together. It's a fear that lives deep inside all of us, a cold, dark dread that whispers in the quietest moments of the night, taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive. It's not just about death, it's about the horrifying space in between. The unimaginable terror of waking up in a box. Your world is 6 sides of wood. The air is thick and stale, tasting of earth and your own panic. Imagine the moment of realization. Your eyes flicker open, but you see nothing. You try to sit up, your head hits a hard surface just inches above your face. You are trapped. You are buried. The weight of the world, literally, is on top of you. The year is 1937. The place is Saint-Quentin-de-Chalais, France. A young man named Angelo Hayes, only 19 years old, goes for a motorcycle ride. But on this day, his ride ends in disaster. A brutal crash throws him from his bike. When help arrives, they find a scene of devastation. Angelo is unresponsive. The local doctor examines him and finds no pulse, no breath. He is declared dead. Within 2 days, Angelo Hayes is placed in a coffin and lowered into the cold French earth. The sound of dirt hitting the lid of his casket is the final note in his short life, or so everyone believed, but deep beneath the ground, in the silent, suffocating dark, something was happening. Angelo was not dead. He was in a deep coma, his body's function slowed to an almost undetectable level. 2 days passed. Down in the darkness, Angelo slowly, agonizingly, began to emerge from the coma. He was buried alive. But fate, or perhaps the insurance company's greed, intervened. They demanded an exhumation to verify the cause of death. When the coffin was raised and the lid pried open, the investigators were met with a shocking sight. Angelo Hayes's body was still warm. His eyes were wide with terror. His hands were covered in bloody scratches. The inside of the coffin lid was covered in bloody scratches. He was alive. We travel now to South Carolina in the summer of 1915. A woman named Essie Dunbar, 30 years old, suffers what appears to be a fatal epileptic seizure. It was a violent, terrible fit. When it was over, she lay still. The town doctor was called in and pronounced Essie Dunbar dead. The funeral was scheduled for the next day. The funeral service was a somber affair. Friends, family, the minister spoke his final words. Essie was placed inside her coffin. The lid was nailed shut. She was lowered into the freshly dug grave in the churchyard. Essie's sister was running late. She raced against time, desperate for one final goodbye. Just as they were patting down the last of the dirt, Essie's sister arrived. She was frantic, begging to see her sister. Reluctantly, they agreed. The gravediggers picked up their shovels again. With a creak of protest, they pried the nails from the lid and lifted it open. What happened next became a local legend. As the lid was lifted, Essie Dunbar sat straight up in her coffin. She smiled at her grieving sister and the stunned mourners. The 3 gravediggers fell backward into the grave. The minister fainted. Chaos erupted as people fled in terror, believing they had witnessed the rising of the dead. In 1968, an Irishman from County Tipperary named Mike Meany decided he would do the unthinkable. He would attempt to break the world record for being buried alive. He had a coffin specially built by a local undertaker, complete with padding, breathing tubes for air, tubes for food and water. On February 21, 1968, a crowd gathered in a builder's yard in Kilburn, London. They watched as Mike Meany, after eating a hearty last meal, climbed into his coffin. He was sealed inside, and the coffin was lowered into a pit over 10 feet deep. The dirt began to fly. Shovelful by shovelful, Mike was buried. He was now alone in the total darkness, with only the tubes connecting him to the world above. His goal, to stay buried for 61 days. The days turned into a grueling routine, but the psychological toll was immense. He was in a sensory deprivation chamber of his own making. He battled loneliness, anxiety, and the constant nagging fear that something could go wrong. Finally, on April 22nd, 1968, after 61 days and nights in the earth, the time came. When the lid was opened, Mike emerged, pale and bearded, but triumphant. He had done it. He had faced the primal fear head-on and won. In 1987, in Kankakee, Illinois, a wealthy media heir named Stephen Small lived a comfortable life. But he had become the target of a monstrous plot. A man named Danny Edwards and his girlfriend, Nancy Risch, planned to kidnap him and demand a ransom. On September 2nd, they lured Stephen from his home with a fake phone call, pretending to be the police. When he arrived, he was abducted at gunpoint. This was not a simple kidnapping. Edwards had built a crude wooden box about 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 3 feet high. It was a makeshift coffin. He forced Stephen Small inside this box and drove him to a remote wooded area. He buried the box in a sandy patch of ground, leaving only a small PVC pipe sticking out of the earth for air. The pipe was poorly designed, barely adequate. Imagine the absolute horror for Stephen Small. He was trapped in a rough, splintery box, buried under 3 feet of sand. The air was thick and humid. Every breath was a struggle. The FBI traced the ransom calls, but time was running out. The flawed design of the breathing tube was fatal. It was not providing enough air to sustain a human life. By the time authorities located the burial site and frantically dug him up, it had been hours. When they finally opened the box, they found he had died. In October 2005, a massive earthquake devastated parts of Pakistan. Buildings crumbled into dust. Entire villages were wiped from the map. Among the missing was a 40-year-old woman named Naksha Bibi. She had been in her kitchen when the world started to shake violently. The walls and ceiling came crashing down around her, plunging her into darkness and silence. Naksha was not killed by the collapse. She was trapped. She found herself in a small, triangular pocket of space, pinned under what was left of her kitchen table. Her legs were crushed by debris. She was surrounded by the rubble of her own home. It was a tomb of concrete and steel. In the total darkness, injured and alone, she could hear nothing but the ringing in her ears. Her survival was a miracle of chance and circumstance. A leaking pipe from a collapsed bathroom dripped water near her face, providing just enough to drink. She also found a small piece of rotten food, a scrap from her former life that she rationed to stay alive. She had no concept of time, only a cycle of waking and sleeping in the pitch-black void. She prayed. She thought of her family, wondering if they were alive or dead. For 63 days, Naksha Bibi remained buried alive, an eternity, but her family refused to give up hope. Her brother kept returning to the ruins of their home, calling out her name. One day, he heard a faint sound, a weak whisper from beneath the rubble. Frantically, he and other villagers began to dig with their bare hands. Hours later, they pulled a skeletal, barely conscious Naksha from the wreckage. She had survived for over 2 months in a concrete grave, a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. The year is 1851. The place, New York City. A young woman named Virginia McDonald lived with her family, but she fell gravely ill and was pronounced dead. She was placed in a coffin and interred at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. Her mother was inconsolable, insisting Virginia was not truly gone. After nearly a week, the family relented. When they pried open the lid, the inside of the coffin lid was shredded. Virginia's fingers were bloody stumps. She had been buried alive. Our final story takes us to Pikeville, Kentucky, late 19th century. A young woman named Octavia Smith Hatcher living a happy life with her husband James. She had just given birth to a baby boy, Jacob, but tragedy struck. The infant died shortly after birth. Octavia plunged into deep, inconsolable depression. Soon she fell into a coma-like state. In January of 1891, she was pronounced dead from an unknown illness. The burial happened quickly. It was a cold winter and embalming was not yet common practice. Octavia was placed in her coffin and buried in the local cemetery. But soon after the funeral, a strange sickness began to spread through the town. Other people fell into the same deep coma-like sleep, only to wake up days later, perfectly fine. It was a sleeping sickness caused by the tsetse fly. A horrifying realization began to dawn on James Hatcher. He raced to the cemetery with a group of men. When they forced the lid open, the sight that greeted them was one of pure terror. Octavia's face was contorted in a scream. The lining of the coffin lid was torn and bloody from her fingernails. She had been alive when they buried her. Picture this. You open your eyes in total darkness, the air is thin, your chest feels heavy, you reach up and your fingers scrape wood, you're trapped. No one can hear your screams. The dirt presses down from above. As the truth sinks in, you've been buried alive. And the worst part, these aren't just nightmares, they're real. True stories of men, women, and even children who lived their last moments sealed in a coffin. Tonight we're opening 10 more cases where the grave wasn't the end. It was the beginning of absolute horror in 10 more buried alive horrors. Story 1. The Graveyard Shift. In 1893, a gravedigger in England was performing his usual duties when something unusual stopped him dead in his tracks. He swore he heard faint cries coming from underground. Thinking he was losing his mind, he pressed his ear to the freshly packed dirt. And there it was again, a muffled, panicked voice. When they dug the coffin back up, they found a young woman inside, her fingernails broken and bleeding, the lid splintered where she had clawed with desperate strength. She had been declared dead only hours before, but she had clearly been alive the entire time. The gravedigger quit his job that night, claiming he could still hear her cries echoing in his ears. Story 2. The Louisiana Girl. In the early 1900s, in Louisiana, a family buried their daughter after she fell ill with a fever that swept through the region. Heartbroken, they sealed her in a tomb above ground, as was the custom. Years later, when the family decided to move her remains to a larger family vault, workers unsealed the tomb, and what they found froze them in place. The girl's small body was no longer lying peacefully. Instead, she was twisted around inside the coffin, her fingernails worn down to the bone, bloody scratches covering the wood. The truth was undeniable. She had been buried alive, waking up in suffocating darkness, fighting until her last breath. Her parents never recovered from the revelation. Story 3. The Resurrected Priest. In 1600s, France, a beloved priest suddenly collapsed in the middle of giving Mass. With no signs of life, his parish declared him dead and quickly buried him in the church's crypt. Days later, parishioners reported hearing strange noises beneath the stone floor during prayer, faint thuds like fists beating on wood. The church dismissed it as superstition until they finally opened the crypt. Inside, they discovered the priest's body, but it was far from at rest. His face was twisted in terror, his lips torn, and his arms were covered in deep bite marks. He had gnawed at his own flesh in a desperate attempt to stay alive. Story 4. Eleanor Markham. In 1894, 22-year-old Eleanor Markham was placed in a coffin after being declared dead. Her funeral was underway. Mourners gathered to say their final goodbyes. But just before the lid was sealed, the undertaker heard a faint whisper, "Don't bury me. I'm not dead yet." Horrified, he threw the lid open. Eleanor's eyes fluttered, her lips trembling as she begged again, "You are burying me alive." She lived, rescued just in time, but she carried a lifelong fear of sleep, terrified she might one day slip away again, this time with no one to hear her voice. Story 5. The Screaming Vault. In Italy, a wealthy family interred one of their relatives in a private stone vault. Soon after, neighbors began whispering about terrible sounds, screams and banging, echoing from inside at night. The family resisted opening the vault, believing the stories to be gossip, but when the noises continued, they finally relented and broke the seal. Inside, the coffin lid was shattered. The corpse's face was frozen in horror, its jaw dislocated, and its hands mangled from pounding against the stone. To this day, locals call it the Screaming Vault. Story 6. The Russian Tragedy. In 2011, in eastern Russia, a 49-year-old woman collapsed after heavy drinking. When paramedics arrived, they declared her dead and sent her body to the morgue. But at her funeral the next day, in the middle of the service, mourners heard a horrific sound. From inside the coffin came frantic pounding and muffled screams. People rushed to open it and found the woman alive, drenched in sweat, wide-eyed in terror. The relief was short-lived. The shock and lack of oxygen had damaged her body beyond recovery. She died just hours later in the hospital, making her ordeal even more tragic. Story 7. The New Orleans Horror. New Orleans is notorious for its above-ground cemeteries, where floods sometimes shift coffins from their resting places. After a particularly strong storm, cemetery workers found one coffin cracked open. Inside was a skeletal figure, but what made it horrifying was the position. The body was not laid flat as it had been buried. Instead, it was curled tightly in a fetal position, the coffin walls scarred with deep scratches. The person had awakened after burial and tried to escape, only to spend their last moments in a suffocating prison of wood and stone. Story 8. The Victorian Safety Coffins. During the Victorian era, fear of premature burial reached its peak. So many corpses were later discovered to have been alive that inventors designed safety coffins, outfitted with bells, flags, or breathing tubes that connected to the surface. Gravediggers reported hearing bells ringing late at night, only to arrive too late. Some coffins were found with the bell pulled down, the cord snapped, and frantic scratch marks inside. The worst cases were the ones where the bell was never heard at all, only discovered years later when coffins were opened to reveal bodies twisted in agony. Story 9. The Polish Woman. In 2014, an elderly woman in Poland was pronounced dead after doctors failed to find a pulse. Her body was placed in a morgue refrigerator for 11 hours. But then, a morgue worker heard pounding, followed by screams. Opening the unit, he found the woman alive, her skin ice cold but her body thrashing in panic. She survived the ordeal, but one terrifying truth remained. If she hadn't woken up when she did, the freezing morgue would have finished what the doctors had started. Story 10. The Ecuador Case. In June of 2023, mourners in Ecuador gathered for the funeral of a 76-year-old woman. Her family wept as the coffin was placed before them until a horrific sound stopped the ceremony. A pounding came from inside the coffin, then faint cries. When they pried the lid open, the woman was alive, gasping for air, her eyes wide with terror. She was rushed to the hospital and placed on life support. Though she lived for several more days, she eventually passed away for good. But her story proves something chilling. The nightmare of being buried alive isn't just history, it's still happening. Imagine waking in total darkness, lungs burning, scratching until your nails rip off, and realizing no one can hear you. For centuries, countless people suffered that very fate. Which of these stories unsettled you the most? Let me know in the comments. And remember, sometimes death doesn't come when it should. Sometimes the coffin closes too soon, and sometimes people need to subscribe to Tales from the Fiend. In a small hospital in Poland, an elderly woman was declared dead after her heart appeared to stop. Doctors signed her death certificate, and her body was taken to the morgue, placed inside a refrigerated drawer. 11 hours later, a morgue worker heard something strange, a thumping sound echoing through the cold room. At first, he thought it was a machine rattling. Then came the sound of a muffled scream. When he opened one of the drawers, he found the woman alive, her body trembling from the cold. She gasped for air and whispered that she'd been awake the whole time, trapped in darkness, unable to move or call for help until her body finally thawed enough to let her scream. She survived, but she could never sleep in silence again. In Caracas, Venezuela, a man named Carlos Camejo was pronounced dead after a car accident. His body was sent to the morgue for an autopsy. When the coroner began cutting into his face to examine the wound, blood began to flow, something that shouldn't happen to a corpse. Then Carlos groaned. The staff froze as the man's eyes snapped open, wide with panic. He had felt everything, the scalpel, the pressure, the first cut, but had been too weak to move or speak. He later said it was like being trapped in a nightmare, aware of everything but powerless to stop it. In Russia, a young bride collapsed during her wedding reception. Doctors couldn't find a pulse and declared her dead. Her devastated family arranged for a quick burial the next day. At the morgue, her body was prepared and placed in a coffin overnight. But in the middle of the night, a security guard patrolling the building heard a noise, soft tapping, then pounding, coming from the viewing room. When he opened the door, he found the coffin lid trembling. Inside was the bride, alive, eyes open wide, gasping for breath. She died of heart failure a few hours later, but not before telling doctors she remembered everything, including being zipped into the body bag. In 2010, a morgue attendant in South Africa fainted after discovering a dead man moving inside one of the refrigerated units. The man had been declared dead from an asthma attack. When he woke up inside the icy drawer, he began screaming and pounding, convinced he was in hell. The attendant opened the door to see the man sitting up, covered in frost, eyes glazed over but very much alive. By the time emergency services arrived, the man's temperature had dropped dangerously low. He survived, but the morgue staff quit the next day, saying they could still hear knocking from the empty drawers. In 2018, a woman in China was sent to the morgue after hospital staff failed to detect her heartbeat. Hours later, a worker noticed movement in one of the body bags. When they opened it, the woman gasped for air, her body trembling violently. She had been alive for hours inside the zipped bag, suffocating slowly while her body refused to die. Security footage later showed the bag writhing faintly for almost 30 minutes before anyone noticed. In the 1970s, a hospital morgue in Mississippi had a night attendant named John. He'd worked there for years and was used to the eerie quiet of the place. One night he walked in to find one of the covered bodies sitting upright on the table. The man had been declared dead from a drug overdose several hours earlier. John thought he was seeing things until the man turned his head and whispered, "It's too cold." John quit that night, leaving the morgue doors unlocked behind him. The patient lived another 2 days before dying for real, but no one ever explained how he sat up. A 62-year-old woman in Detroit was declared dead after being found unresponsive at her home. Paramedics followed protocol, checked her vitals multiple times, and sent her body to the morgue. Hours later, as workers were preparing to embalm her, she suddenly took a deep, rattling breath. The mortician screamed and dropped his tools as she opened her eyes. When she finally recovered, she said she remembered hearing voices around her, feeling hands move her body, and the suffocating cold. But the worst part, she said, was realizing she couldn't scream, no matter how hard she tried. In 2014, a woman in Brazil was declared dead after suffering complications during childbirth. Her family was devastated. The hospital sent her to the morgue, where she was to be kept overnight before burial. But when her husband came to identify the body, he noticed something strange: condensation on the inside of the morgue bag. Panicked, he called for help. The morgue worker opened the bag and found her breathing shallowly, her eyes flickering. She survived, but she remembered being trapped in total darkness, hearing voices around her and thinking she was in her own grave. In the 1980s, a man in India was pronounced dead after a heart attack and placed in the morgue's cold storage. The next morning, the staff discovered the freezer door open and the man lying on the floor. At first, they thought it was a break-in until they checked the security footage. The man had opened the drawer himself. He had clawed his way out during the night, collapsing a few feet away from safety. The hospital quietly removed the footage, and his family was simply told that he died peacefully. In Ecuador, mourners gathered for the funeral of a 76-year-old woman who had been declared dead after suffering a cardiac arrest. As the family prayed, a faint knocking echoed from inside the coffin. At first, no one wanted to believe it, but when the lid began to rattle, panic erupted. They opened it to find the woman alive, her face pale, her breathing shallow, her eyes darting around in terror. She had been conscious inside the morgue for hours, aware of everything. Her last words before she died again were a whisper, "I told you I wasn't ready." The morgue is supposed to be where life ends, a place of silence, stillness, and finality. But these stories remind us that sometimes death makes mistakes. To wake up surrounded by the dead, trapped in the cold, unable to scream, it's a fate worse than death itself. Which of these stories chilled you the most? Let me know in the comments, and remember, not everyone who's pronounced dead stays that way, and not all of you are subscribed to Tales from the Fiend. Story 1. Angelo Hayes. In 1977, 19-year-old Angelo Hayes was involved in a violent motorcycle accident in France. His injuries were catastrophic, and his breathing was barely detectable. Doctors pronounced him dead, and within days he was buried. The coffin was lowered into the earth, and the soil packed above it, leaving him completely enclosed in darkness. Inside that coffin, time became a distorted, suffocating sensation. He had no way of knowing how long he had been underground. Every instinct screamed at him that he had died, but then consciousness returned, terrifying and real. I woke up and everything was black. I thought I had gone blind. I tried to blink. I tried to open my eyes wider, but nothing changed. I tried to move my arms and they wouldn't respond. Something heavy was pushing on my chest. I couldn't move. The air was thick and every breath felt smaller than the last. I reached up and felt solid wood inches from my face. I understood then. I was buried. I screamed, but the sound never left my throat. Panic came in waves. I drifted in and out of consciousness. My parents had requested an exhumation after insurance investigators demanded an autopsy, and when the coffin was opened, I was still alive. If they had waited one more day, I would not be here. Above ground, no one suspected a miracle was about to occur. By the time the coffin was exhumed, Angelo was still alive, his body frail, but his mind screaming with the memory of the darkness. Story 2. Paul Kirker. In 1937, Paul Kirker was declared dead after a sudden illness. His funeral took place the same day he was buried, and all mourners believed he was gone. Hours later, the impossible happened. Paul awoke in total darkness, trapped inside his coffin. Every instinct screamed panic, every second stretching into eternity. He felt the pressure of the wooden lid, smelled the damp, earthy air pressing into his nostrils, and realized that he was fully aware of his predicament. I remember trying to stretch and hitting wood. I knew exactly where I was. The air smelled like dirt and old wood. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I began clawing at the lid above me, scraping until my fingers bled. I thought no one was coming. The soil above me moved with every desperate push I made. Hours later, grave robbers passing by noticed the dirt shifting unnaturally. They called for help and dug me out just in time. I was barely breathing. I don't sleep in silence anymore. Above him, the world continued. The soil over his coffin had no idea it had trapped a living man, each grain pressing down as if mocking his struggle. The faint movements that finally drew attention from the outside seemed almost impossible to him, as if the earth itself had been watching his panic and only then allowed someone to notice. Story 3. The woman declared dead from hypothermia. A woman in Eastern Europe was found unconscious in freezing temperatures and pronounced dead. She was transported to the morgue, her body carefully laid in a cold, sterile drawer. Hours later, she returned to consciousness, trapped inside a narrow metal container. The cold made every movement impossible at first. Her limbs refused to obey her commands, and panic began to claw at her mind. She could hear the faint hum of the morgue around her, but felt completely isolated from life itself. I couldn't move my arms, they were stiff and cold. I thought I was paralyzed. Then I heard the door close. I realized I was still alive. I screamed until my throat burned. The staff finally heard me. I still smell disinfectant when I think about it. The trauma of confinement, the knowledge that her body had been assumed dead, lingered long after her rescue. Every noise now reminded her of that drawer and the suffocating terror of being trapped. Story 4. The Man Who Woke During His Funeral. In the early 1900s, a man suffering from catalepsy was pronounced dead after his body became rigid and unresponsive. His family arranged a small funeral, closing the coffin and gathering mourners to pay their last respects. Inside, the man was trapped, conscious and aware of every sound, yet unable to move. The faint creak of the coffin's hinges, the rustling of clothing, and the distant sobs of his loved ones became an unbearable symphony of terror. Hours later, the family, suspicious of irregularities in his pulse and the stiffness of his body, insisted the coffin be reopened to confirm death. The gravediggers hesitated, but eventually the coffin lid was lifted. I heard voices. They sounded far away, muffled and underwater. I tried to move, but my body would not listen. At first I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard crying. I realized it was real. I was awake, trapped, and about to be buried alive. When the coffin was finally opened, he was physically exhausted, his mind scorched by the terror of those moments. Every funeral thereafter reminded him that death could come without warning, yet life could be imprisoned in the darkness above. Story 5. The Kidnapping Survivor. During a violent home invasion, a man was abducted and buried alive in a shallow grave. The drugs in his system delayed his awareness, but when he woke, the weight of soil pressed down on him like a nightmare made real. He could feel every clod of earth around him, hear the tiny shifts as it settled with his every breath, and smell the raw, choking scent of dirt mixed with panic. The isolation was suffocating, the silence pressing in until every heartbeat seemed deafening. Panic and survival instincts collided, forcing him to push, claw, and wriggle in a desperate attempt to escape. I woke up choking. Dirt was in my mouth and nose. I couldn't breathe properly. The weight of the dirt was crushing my chest. I didn't know which way was up. I started pushing with my knees and elbows. I don't remember getting out. I remember the sky. The ground feels like it's watching me. When he finally emerged, sunlight hit his face like a revelation. The experience left a permanent mark on him. The memory of the earth closing in, the smell of dirt, and the overwhelming awareness of being truly alive yet trapped. Story 6. Carlos Kameny. In 2013, Carlos Kameny was performing maintenance in a cemetery when a grave wall suddenly collapsed, burying him under several feet of earth. Instantly trapped, the soil pressed heavily against his chest, making every breath a laborious task. The cold, damp dirt clung to his clothes and skin, filling his nostrils and mouth, while the muffled sounds of the world above seemed impossibly far away. There was no warning. The dirt just took me. The pressure knocked the air out of my lungs. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The dirt filled my mouth. Panic set in immediately. Your body fights you. It wants to breathe even when it can't. I stayed still, focusing on conserving oxygen. I knew if I moved, the dirt would settle and I'd lose what little air I had. When they pulled me out, I don't dream about being buried. I feel it, like it's happening again. Every second stretched into an eternity, his mind calculating oxygen, position, and the fragility of his limbs as he fought not to succumb to the earth itself. Story 7. Anna Bogenholm. In 1999, Swedish doctor Anna Bogenholm fell into a frozen ravine while skiing, sliding under ice and snow until she was completely trapped. The crushing weight of ice and snow pressed against her, slowing her heart and freezing her body into a terrifying immobility. Every attempt to move was met with extreme resistance, her fingers and limbs stiffening as oxygen grew scarce. It was completely black. I didn't know which way was up. I found a tiny pocket of air near my face. I remember thinking, this is all the air I will ever have. My body grew numb. My heart slowed. I felt myself disappearing. When the rescuers reached me, I was clinically dead. I didn't know I had survived until much later. I thought I was already gone. The minutes, or was it hours, felt endless. She could hear the faint crack of ice above her, the occasional rush of air as snow shifted, and yet the blackness remained unbroken. Every moment became a battle of consciousness against an unforgiving weight of ice and darkness. Story 8: The Man Who Woke During Exhumation. A man declared dead from alcohol poisoning was buried and later exhumed for investigation. The cemetery workers were shocked when, upon opening the coffin, the man suddenly struggled, fully conscious and aware of his own burial. I woke up choking. Something was pressing on my face. I tried to move my arms, but they would not respond. They were not mine anymore. The silence underground was worse than the lack of air. I understood I was underground before I realized I was alive. The horror of being considered dead while fully aware of his surroundings left a permanent scar. He later described the feeling of helplessness, the silent pressure of the coffin walls, and the disorienting gap between awareness and movement as nothing he could ever forget. Story 9: The Woman Who Dug for Her Child. In 2020, a woman and her young child were kidnapped and buried in a shallow grave. She regained consciousness to find soil pressing on her chest, her child stirring beside her. Panic surged immediately, yet survival instincts took over, pushing her to act despite limited air and space. I woke up with dirt in my mouth. I thought I was dead. Then I heard breathing. Not mine, my child's. Pain didn't matter. Air didn't matter. Only reaching the surface. I clawed upward until my fingers bled. I don't remember the moment I got out. I remember the sky. I don't fear death anymore. I fear silence. The escape became a battle against time and suffocating earth. Each movement brought new pressure and dirt into her lungs, but the presence of her child gave her purpose. That drive kept her alive until sunlight finally broke through the soil above. Story 10: The Coffin That Scratched from the Inside. In the 1800s, a woman was pronounced dead and buried in a small rural cemetery. The coffin was placed in a narrow grave surrounded by damp, compacted soil. Inside, she awoke to find herself fully conscious, yet utterly trapped. The earth pressed down from all sides, the coffin walls pressing into her limbs and chest, making every movement a battle against suffocating pressure. She could feel the weight of the soil shift slightly with her every attempt to move, hear the faint creaks of the wood, and smell the cold, musty scent of the grave. Time became meaningless. Every second stretched into an eternity as fear and panic coiled tighter around her chest. The struggle for air and space was exhausting. Every attempt to move sent tremors through the coffin, each scrape of her nails leaving deep marks on the wood. She was acutely aware of the fragility of her own body, the thin layer of wood between her and the crushing weight of earth above. The isolation was absolute. The sounds of the living world above reached her like distant echoes from another reality, mocking her entrapment. I woke up screaming. The air was gone. It felt like drowning without water. I thought my heart was going to burst. Though she survived only briefly, the physical and psychological terror she endured left an indelible mark. The scratch marks left inside the coffin became a chilling warning, a testament to the nightmare of consciousness trapped in a tomb. Even centuries later, the story evokes the most primal fears: to be alive, fully aware, and yet utterly imprisoned beneath the soil. Every time these stories are told, one thing becomes clear. Being buried alive is not just about death, it's about awareness, about knowing the world is still moving above you, about understanding that help might never come. These people survived long enough to explain what the darkness was like, and some say when the world goes quiet, they can still feel the earth pressing in. They can still subscribe to Tales from the Fiend. They can still click on the right and watch all my other buried alive videos. Being buried alive isn't just about dying. It's about the moment you understand what's happening, when the air grows thin and panic becomes louder than your own heartbeat. Many of the people in these stories survived, but none of them ever escaped the memory. Some never slept in the dark again. Some refused closed spaces for the rest of their lives. And some said the worst part wasn't the coffin, it was the silence above it. If these stories stayed with you, remember this. For most of history, death was guessed, and sometimes they guessed wrong. Comment what story scared you the most. Please like and subscribe for more Tales from the Fiend.